At this time, I'd like to introduce Charles Duffy, who is a member of the State Executive Committee, but I'm also proud to say he is my first vice chair in Westchester County. So Charlie, come on up. He will introduce the next speaker.
Well, hello everyone. I am honored to be one of the first people to be given the responsibility of introducing a guest, and I welcome everyone. So with that, I would love to begin the introduction. Mr. Edmund J. McMahon is president of the Empire Center for Public Policy, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank here in Albany. Mr. McMahon is also a 20-year senior fellow with the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, which he joined in June of 2000. With that, Mr. McMahon, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm focusing on giving you an overview of the situation with the state's economy, the lay of the land with our demography, and last of all, the high and low points of the budget. I'm kind of thinking of this in terms of beginning a new decade, the 20s, hence my title. I just realized, Jerry, this is the fourth decade that in which I've had the honor of speaking to this. I look so every bit as old as I look. I'm going to start with an overview of that. One thing I always frame my presentations with is a reminder that New York is not only a large state and a very diverse state in many other ways. It's increasingly a state that's kind of bifurcated. Whoops, I got to put this on before it'll work. There we go. There's an upstate and downstate split increasingly that's political and economic and fiscal. That's something to keep in mind when we look at the statistics for the economy of the state and budget issues. Here's the 21st century so far in terms of job growth in New York State. Now that looks pretty good, doesn't it? Actually, we had kind of a dead first decade, and then the teens were pretty good. That's a pretty steep rise in private sector employment, which is a leading economic indicator that we have fastest, at least, at the state level and the regional level. However, if you look at the components of that growth, the blue bar is job growth in New York City. That's how many of those jobs are in New York City. The orange is the downstate suburbs, the lower Hudson Valley and Long Island. The gray is upstate. Upstate I define as the 50 counties north of the Mid-Hudson. So what you can see is that a great deal of the growth, this is over 1 million jobs. This is about 1.25 million jobs the state has gained, private sector jobs, since the recession. 800 some odd thousand of those jobs are in New York City, where employment is at an all-time high. The reason the governor can announce every month that employment in the state has reached an all-time high is because employment in New York City, as well as its population, has reached an all-time high. Then you see the suburban chunk of that, and then you see upstate, which is still in a state of pretty significant relative decline. Another aspect of this is the breakdown. By the way, you know, anybody who wants to even see a number here, a downloadable version of this slide deck will be made available and disseminated. You'll get the link from Sean Ray when I'm done to condense it, so that if anything on here strikes your interest and you want to make use of it, you'll have it. So that's the region by region, and again, you can see the job growth has been overwhelmingly downstate. These are the specific numbers for the last, since 2010, when Governor Cuomo took office, which is also when jobs bottomed out, before he took office, that is, and in the last year. In fact, in the last year, several regions of the state actually had drops in employment. So, one thing people often look at in terms of employment is the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate in New York, as across much of the country, is at or near, depending on the region, an all-time low also. We've gone right back down to some of the lowest unemployment rates on record. Again, and I would say the governor often says, he says this on and on, again again and again, even though people like me point out where the number comes from. He cites this as the main indicator that things are getting better because upstate and downstate unemployment is lower. You see there, outside New York City, in New York City, unemployment below 4%. That's pretty good. However, there's a big difference in where these numbers come from. This is a chart that shows the composition of the unemployment rate in downstate New York. By the way, in case you don't know, the unemployment rate comes from a survey. It's like a poll. It's a household survey. People are phoned. They're asked how many people in the household are working age, how many of those people are seeking work, how many of those people are employed. You put all those numbers together and you get the size of the labor force and the unemployment rate. Downstate, the blue line is the unemployment, the blue bar is the unemployment rate. You can see it, 3.8%. The labor force, which is the blue line, the number of people in the labor force seeking work has gone up by a couple of 100,000. It's gone down a little bit in the last year, but there's more people in the labor force looking for work. And the red line has been out. There's more residents of downstate who report they are employed. Thus, as a result, the unemployment rate's lower. However, upstate, you see the unemployment rate has gone down also. It's even lower than it is downstate. But look at why that is. The labor force has tumbled. Hundreds of thousands of fewer people in the labor force upstate. And fewer people actually reporting they're employed. So actually you have a lower unemployment rate and fewer people saying they're employed. That's why the unemployment rate is lower upstate. Not because there's more people employed, but because there's fewer people in the labor force. There's a paradox to this, by the way. Whenever I go to upstate New York, this is a common refrain. The regions of upstate New York, upstate New York is starved for growth, for income growth, for growth in wealth, it's just not as dynamic as it needs to be. However, what is the number one concern of businesses in upstate New York? If you are one, you know the answer. Can't find workers. So you have a vicious cycle. The cycle is you're in this sort of death spiral where you're not keeping enough people in your working population, where you don't have enough economic dynamism. At the same time, the businesses that are there and want to grow can't find workers. Or as many businesses put it, especially businesses that employ skilled and semi-skilled blue-collar labor, I can't find people who can show up on time and pass the drug test. So this is a real problem. This is another chart that shows, this is personal income growth by county in the nation. I found this interesting because where the shading is pale, that means there's been that personal income has actually gone down or not grown at all. If you look at New York State on that map, you know where it is. Look at how much of New York State, of that mosaic of New York State is very pale. And that's a bigger concentration of low or no growth than you'll find anywhere else in the country. So, all right, now here's an issue that everybody has been talking about and pays attention to. We jump on the census data every year and try to explain what's going on, and that is the change in our population and out-migration of New Yorkers. This chart, and by the way, all of this is detailed in the reports we have at the table there. Bob DiCostanzo of the Empire Center is there. Please take our material. I don't want Bob to have to carry it back. We also, as your attention grows with this presentation, you can take a squeezable little piggy there and work out your stress. But for instance, our detailed report on population, our 2 detailed reports on population are among the things you can find in. This chart, I look at this, okay, this is almost 60 years of migration trends. The census data that allow you to count this started in the early 60s. We're talking about this more and more, it seems, but maybe see the pink, the jagged line and the sort of pinkish red blob there on that chart over time? That's what's called domestic migration. That's people who live in New York in one year and move in the next year to another state. Let me point out something. This didn't start yesterday. It didn't start last year. It didn't start a decade ago. It started 50 years ago. It was actually at its worst in the 70s. In the last decade, from 2010 to 2019, over 1 million New Yorkers more have moved out than people moved into New York. So despite Eric Adams less concerned about people from Ohio coming in and crowding up Brooklyn. There's not enough of them to offset the number of people in Brooklyn who are leaving. However, we're going to get into the nature of that in a minute. One of the things that's also an irony in terms of what was propping up the population was international immigration. That's the blue area on that chart. The black line is the difference between the two. And what was happening is that we had enough immigrants, foreign immigrants, moving into New York State, mainly to the New York City metro area, to offset a lot of the outflow. In some cases, in some years, a few years actually was more than the outflow, and so we had a net migration gain. Immigrants are also younger on average and have children, and so that boosts the birth rate. However, there's been a slowdown in immigration in the last few years. It's partly related to Trump administration policies, but there's been a big slowdown, and that actually has caused the fact that actually causes the population to go down total. This is the latest data on population by county is from last spring. The next data will be out in a few months. So 43 of the 50 upstate counties have continued losing total population since 2010. 43 of the 50. They have the red shading. The counties that are gaining have light blue or dark blue shading. So you can see which ones they are there. But actually, in the latest year for which we have data, more population loss occurred in New York City, which is the first time that's happened in a while, than upstate. And that's due to the foreign immigration count changing. It's also why you hear even more than ever, this happens every 10 years, but even more than ever, the Cuomo administration is pushing very hard to make sure they count everybody, and some people twice, probably. Congressional seats. This is the domestic migration outflow, the outflow to other states. There's only 2 counties in New York since 2010. When we've been losing 1 million more people than we gained from other states, there's only 2 counties that actually gain, that actually have more people flowing into them than flowing out to the rest of the country. Those 2 counties are Saratoga, just north of here, and Ontario, and Rochester. I've talked about this in the past. Those are the 2 big greenfield, tourism-oriented counties that don't have big fat old cities in them, don't have high taxes by regional standards, and have been growing for decades. Saratoga is the Ontario of Albany, or Ontario is the Saratoga of Rochester, depending on how you look at it. Where are New Yorkers going? Well, yes, Florida, but not all Florida. We have a rollover map. If you go to our website, that's the web address there. Again, you don't have to take it down. You can find it easily, or I'll put this presentation online. That's a rollover map. So if you put your finger or a mouse over it, depending on what you're using, you can see for each state, how many New Yorkers went there, what their average income was. Florida is the leading state, but actually New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut combined have more New Yorkers moving to them than Florida does. This is a thing to keep in mind. What are the top 10 destination states for New Yorkers? Okay, Florida's one. That's the top one. Texas is one of them, so are the Carolinas. But also in the top 10, number 2 is New Jersey. Also in the top 10, Connecticut, not a low-tax state. Jersey, not a low-tax state. California. If you have high income, California is not a low-tax state for high income. There's more bi-coastal moves from New York to California back again. There have been in a while. Some of it's subsidized by the film credit, no doubt. But that kind of shows you the pattern of where New Yorkers are going. And again, we have more of this on our website. Along with all of this comes a decline in school enrollment. There's a national trend, I'm sure you've heard of it, there's a birth dearth. The largest generation in American history was the baby boomers, i.e. people getting really old like me. Then there's the baby boom, followed by the baby boom. There was a baby bust immediately following the baby boom. Then there's the millennial generation, which is actually, the baby boomers were the largest, now the largest in raw numbers generation in American history are millennials, usually defined as people born between roughly 80 and 2000. But the millennials are not having kids at the same rate as their parents. Birth rates are tailing off, marriage rates are later, birth rates are lower. This is a national trend. Add that national trend to the population trends I told you about, and you've got school enrollment declining. Total public school enrollment in New York is at its lowest level in 30 years, and in a few years will be at its lowest level since 1957 or 58, which was early in the or about the middle of the baby boom era. This should have some, among other things, if you don't have young people, that's not good. If you don't have children with families, that's not good. On the other hand, it also says something about school funding issues and pressure for ever larger, ever more billions on the nation's best funded, to be spent on the best funded schools when you've got enrollment dropping at this rate. This shows you where, this is a map of all the school districts in the state. Everything that's shaded red or pink on that map has dropping enrollment. Everything rated shaded green or dark green, light green, has got some gaining in enrollment. Generally what's happening is, this is in the last 10 years. So the city is still, New York City is still up slightly in the last 10 years, it's been declining lately. The two types of districts generally gaining enrollment, it's only about 1 out of every 6 or 7. The most affluent suburban districts are gaining enrollment because they have a generational turnover, and the millennials who are doing really well who live in the city are moving to places like Syosset and Mamaroneck and Rye, so they have growing enrollment. And poor, old, crumbling inner suburbs and upstate cities have growing enrollment, which is also sort of an urban exodus and also immigration. Those are the two types of places that are growing. Rural districts are really collapsing fast. So that's the demographic backdrop. Now let's switch to the state budget, which the governor unveiled on Tuesday. As usual, I'll give you the overview of the major figures. I always focus, yellow highlight here is state operating funds. What's state operating funds? That's the measure of spending that is operating expenditures, not including capital, that is supported by taxes and fees and other revenues that the legislature completely controls. These are taxes and fees and other revenues that are imposed directly by Albany by vote of the legislature, or should be by vote of the legislature and the governor. So that's a key measure. Now, everything you've heard about, Jerry talked about there being about the state running deficits. As you probably heard, if you pay any attention to this, the state ran into a much bigger deficit in this past year, which was related entirely to Medicaid. The Medicaid budget was suddenly emerged, had been overexpended by $4 billion. By the way, a problem that Bill Hammond of the Empire Center was first to call attention to, which was not acknowledged in the state's financial plan documents until after the budget was passed last year. It was sort of concealed, although parts of it were hiding in plain sight, it turns out. So the Medicaid budget, but basically what the governor did last year was take almost $2 billion in Medicaid expenditures and delay paying bills for a few days or weeks so that they would be moved from fiscal 19, which ended in March last year, into fiscal 20, which began in April, in order to basically keep the numbers looking good. This created a compounded problem of $4 billion. That's a big problem. And so the state faced a $6 billion budget gap coming into this budget. $6 billion. Actually more than $6 billion because the governor keeps pledging he's holding spending increases at 2%. And in order to do that, he had to reduce projected spending by $6.9 billion. So the budget he presented had to be balanced. It is balanced on paper. How did he do that? Well, let's first talk about this Medicaid issue. Here's the biggest whopper in the budget. This line appears early in the financial plan document. It refers to the Medicaid gap as something which emerged abruptly at the end of fiscal year 2019. Those words are directly from the governor's budget. That is not true. It did not emerge abruptly at the end of 2019. This is what we thought we were getting when they passed the budget last year. This is what emerged after they started getting honest about the numbers. Now, there's cash flow every quarter. You know, you run a business, or you watch a business, or you analyze it. Every quarter, there's cash flow. How much cash is going out the door? I want you to kind of, in your mind, think about Medicaid. Medicaid doesn't have too much in seasonal variations. Quarter by quarter by quarter, it's a certain amount, and then as the program gets more expensive, it goes up. Now, you would expect cash flow in any program like Medicaid to go along a relatively jagged line, but not too jagged, like this. Here is what cash flow on the Medicaid program actually looked like, which is either an earthquake or a heart attack, depending on what metaphor you want to use. What those zigs and zags suddenly within the past year indicate is they began delaying Medicaid payments in order to hide the problem at least 2 years ago. And they began hiding more and more and more until, as you see at the end of the chart, they delayed so many that it created such a big problem that they couldn't hide it or deny it anymore. That was not something that appeared abruptly in 2019. That was something that was building. So how did they close that gap? This is a rundown of how he closed the gap. Basically, remember, any budget gap includes what he assumes he's going to spend, the governor. So he just is spending less than he assumed he was going to spend. The biggest change was in school aid. Instead of a nearly $1 billion increase, which would be 4%, it's going to be an increase of $700 million or so, which will be 3%. There were cuts in other categories. It gets kind of technical, but this is basically reducing projected expenditures. But what's he doing about that Medicaid thing? What's he doing? Well, they made a bookkeeping change in which they belatedly actually did attribute almost $2 billion of Medicaid spending to the year in which it occurred, which was a year ago. Which means that that spending in that year didn't go up 2%, or almost 4%. And then they have $2.5 billion to deal with. How is the governor going to reduce projected Medicaid spending by $2.5 billion? The answer is, we don't know. He is kicking it to something he calls a Medicaid redesign team, which he has not formally created, but he's announced who its head co-chairs will be, which is Michael Dowling, a former Mario Cuomo aide who heads the Northwell in Long Island, one of the largest, most profitable hospital chains in New York, and Dennis Rivera. Yes, that Dennis Rivera, the guy who created and built the Healthcare Workers Union and whose alliance with George Pataki helped make the Medicaid program what it is today. Those are the two people in charge of finding out how to save money on Medicaid through this redesign team. So that's what's going to occur, but 1/3 of the budget gap was closed in another way. Receipts were higher than expected. Now, generally, any budget should try to guess low on receipts. This one guessed extra low, so there's actually a lot more receipts. I'll get to that in a minute. So how's the spending broken down? Well, this table looks almost the same every year when I come here for people who've seen it before, because basically the spending is dominated by 4 categories. The top 2, and I'll show you how they divide up in a second, school aid and Medicaid. General state charges, which is mainly pension and employee health insurance, and the operation of state agencies, which has gone up the least. And then everything else combined is down slightly in the governor's proposal. Here's what I'm going to getting ahead of myself a little. Here's the best part of the budget. If you want to talk about its strongest attribute, one of its 2. There's much less action going on the revenue side of this budget than we've seen in at least a decade. There's hardly anything to speak of in the revenue area by New York terms. There's no major tax increases really, except something affecting cigarette wholesalers, and that is not that big. There's no tax increases in the budget. There are some small tax cuts. There is a small business tax cut that is very small because actually it's only in the corporate tax, and most small businesses are not organized as C corps. There is belatedly 2 years out an increase in the child credit for younger children, ages 0 to 4, only for low-income parents. That could be better, but it's better than nothing. And there's an extension of an existing credit. There's something called a hybrid credit. That's it. There's not much happening. That's good news. No news is good news. How's the budget break down? Again, over half the budget is school aid and Medicaid. Another 1/5 is state agency operations. And then the remaining quarter, 25 to 30%, is basically everything else. You hear a lot about pensions in major states, pension problems. What's up with state pensions? The answer is nothing. After skyrocketing early in the decade, they basically reached a plateau. So that's not a big cost driver. It's high, but it's not a cost driver. Employee health insurance costs are going up, but the headcount has been going up slowly after flattening under Governor Cuomo. But generally, state agency operations are being held down in terms of the budget. And you see everything else there. Where's the money come from? I can't stress this enough, and I will stress it a lot. Personal income tax is the name of the game in New York State more than ever. It's over half of state operating funds revenue. It's 2/3 or more of total state tax revenue alone. And then the next biggest piece is consumption taxes, and then again, then there's everything else. But all of the volatility, all the dynamism, and everything rides more than ever on the personal income tax, which is 100 years old this year. One thing that Governor Cuomo deserves credit for, which is, if you look at state operating funds alone, he has held down the growth in state operating fund spending, by that measure, more than any governor in recent history for a longer period. George Pataki's first term was pretty good, specifically his first 3 years. After that, not so good. George Pataki's last 6 years had an enormous spending increase, in part because the legislature repeatedly overrode his vetoes of increased spending. The only other governor across 8 years to hold spending adjusted for inflation flatter than this was Hugh Carey during the high inflation era of the 70s and early 80s. However, there's another measure of spending. And I had not looked at this in previous years because it's only begun to change recently, and that is what's known as all funds. The number you often hear in press reports is a $170 billion budget, some very large figure. The state operating funds budget is $102 billion or so, 104 billion, pardon me. All funds, quote unquote, is the entire budget, including capital spending and federal aid, much of which is Medicaid. Now, in this case, there's been a considerable jump in spending since Cuomo's first term. It's basically gone up 14% after inflation under Governor Cuomo, and all of that has been since 2015. A lot of that principally reflects, I think, our success in drawing down Medicaid money. Ironically, all of the shouting about Republicans control Congress and about the Trump administration, through all of that, the state has been really drawing down a lot of money from the federal government. It's both Medicaid and it is the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and our share of money for the expansion of Medicaid. And our reimbursement under that is now beginning to decrease as scheduled. So that's a problem that is contributing to the Medicaid issue, but was totally predictable. Okay, let's look at the overview. I always say one way or the other, what's the good, the bad, the ugly of the budget? Just the budget. I'm not going to get into all the bad and ugly like some of the things Jerry mentioned, because a lot of what's ugly and bad is not in the budget. Some things non-budget related are in the budget. So let's look at highlights and lowlights. What's the good? Well, there's spending restraint. There is. State operating fund spending is restrained again, especially when you consider, this was true in previous years, but starting last year, it's even more true when you have both houses of the legislature and the entire legislature controlled by a near supermajority of people who would like to spend a lot more, of liberal and progressive Democrats who would like to spend a lot more than the governor would. Spending restraint, there's no tax hikes, as I said. The small tax rate cut for small businesses, which ideally would be bigger, the child credit expansion, which ideally would be bigger, and the governor is putting a few $100 million more in the state's budgetary reserves, but still not enough, and the reserves still aren't big enough, which is a problem I'll get to in a minute. The bad, I don't know where to start. Most of what's bad about the budget involves the governor's habit of, in associated legislation, proposing different law changes that have nothing to do with the budget. Now, that doesn't mean they have to. Most of these will be deleted or ignored. They don't have to be done. But he proposes them with the budget, makes it sound like they're part of the budget, although they're not. There is the Bond Act. I don't know what's worse about the $3 billion Environmental Bond Act he's proposed. The fact that he's proposing the Bond Act, which is pretty poorly defined, incredibly vague, and leaves in with a lot of discretion. I don't know what's worse, that or its name. I kind of am divided. I hate that he calls it the Restore Mother Nature Bond Act, which is clunky and bad in so many ways, but it's a matter of taste. A statutory ban on fracking, which they banned in the regulatory sense already. They're going to raise the income level for Excelsior scholarships. I have a whole report on that, which you'll find at the table. I won't go into it later. I think Excelsior scholarships is terrible. We have the best means-tested tuition assistance program in the country. We have the largest private sector, higher ed sector in the country, which is treated equally and not discriminated against by our means-tested tuition assistance program. Excelsior is all about SUNY CUNY, mainly SUNY, and only them. And it is meant to make the governor be able to check off a Democratic Party soundbite, quote-unquote, free tuition. It's got a lot of caveats. It's not what it pretends to be, nor should it be what it pretends to be. We have low tuitions. Kids from families making $125,000 a year should be required to pay their SUNY tuition, which is in some cases about half of what's tuition at a private Catholic high school would be. So this is a expensive political stunt that's being made worse. Expanding prevailing wage, there's much more other things. There's the film credit, the biggest single corporate subsidy giveaway by any state to any industry is New York's film and TV production credit. The governor is taking the credit and making it 25% of expenses instead of 30%. That's not cutting it. That's because the line is so long for these credits by company producers clamoring to do things in New York that they're running out before they can get to the head of the line. So he's going to take the same big fat pie and cut it into some more slices and extend the credit for one more year. $420 million a year now through the middle of the decade, 2025. He's appointed some commission to recommend standards for gig work, which will not be good. He's punting that for now. He's giving the unions more access to employees at the time of orientation to help the public employee unions sign them up before they know what the deal is. And there's more where that came from. That's the bad. The ugly is this whole Medicaid treatment. The punting to the Medicaid redesign task force, also a new provision that is meant to start clawing back money from the counties in New York City, which I go into detail where anybody wants to, but he's claiming that the counties in New York City need to help save money on Medicaid, even though they're very disingenuous. We'll see how it goes with the legislature. Part of it is part of his annual pull the wings off Bill de Blasio exercise, I think. But the other part of it is meant to put counties on the defensive. Now, you may remember, anybody who was paying attention, remember a year ago this week? Remember the press conference the governor had with something happened a year ago this week, if you were paying attention? In case you don't remember, here's the lead. Remember this? Uh-oh. Oh my gosh. We've got a $2 billion shortfall in our revenue, and it's the federal tax reform. What are we going to do? This is awful. They had a joint press conference, which he almost never does. And a reporter asked him there, how serious is this, Governor? He memorably replied, it's serious as a heart attack. Very, very bad. Now, this was, I think, in part designed to put the legislature on notice. Don't try to spend more than we have. We don't have much. Now, the problem is, are we all familiar with the boy who cried wolf? And what that does for your credibility? Okay. Well, it turned out it wasn't quite a heart attack or even an angina pain. It was a little bit of a warning. Here's what actually has been happening with state personal income tax receipts. Cuomo's first 7 years, through fiscal 2017, it goes up 4.8% a year, 4.6% a year. Not bad. That's what it was, okay? All right, now, it goes down. See that where it goes down? It goes way up, higher, then it goes down. What happened was, and you may have done this yourself, before the new federal tax law took effect, at the end of calendar year 17, which was in fiscal 18, a lot of people, especially high earners and business owners with complex returns, accelerated income into 2017 before the new federal tax law took effect. This caused a drop-off, a sharp drop-off, of a kind of a boomerang effect. In the early first quarter, the following year, it created timing irregularities in the revenues. That's that up and down you see. The red dotted line is what the governor was projecting receipts would do after that disruption, at this sort of a hiccup. Now note, the governor coming into this year, this is back last spring, was projecting pretty good receipts growth. What's happened is receipts growth has been even better than he projected, and while on this chart the number looks small, personal income taxes alone in the final quarter of calendar 2019 were $1 billion higher than the governor projected. So what's actually going on? You see that for statistics fans? That's the trend line. They're projecting taxes right on the trend line of 2010 through 2017. So that wasn't a heart attack. We have a problem, and we have a lot to worry about. But the problem is when you keep claiming there's a 4-alarm fire, to mix metaphors again, and it doesn't quite happen on time, this convinces all the people who want to tax millionaires and billionaires that it's all bogus and that we can do this with impunity. That's the problem. This is what the governor said that was correct. It encourages high-income payers to go to other states. Even if a small number leaves, it can have a dramatic effect. Yes, this is completely true. Truer words never spoken by the governor on this subject. Tax the rich, tax the rich, tax the rich. We did, God forbid, the rich leave. He's right. Especially keeping in mind the income tax share of our taxes is higher than ever. Let me remind you of something else. In 2016, the legislature passed a new tax law that over 8 years is phasing in a big income tax cut. Now, that's a big complicated table there. I'll boil it down for you. In the taxable income ranges, this is for married couples. We have the ranges are different, about half as much for singles and between for head of household. For married filers, make it from roughly 28 all the way up to 321. There's 3 tax brackets there. The rates in all those brackets are in the process of going down a lot. That's what's happening. We're in the middle of that tax cut now. The governor announces it every year as if it's a new thing. It was legislated, put into law in 2016. It's ongoing. This is what it will save people. These were the average median income, family incomes in different parts of the state as of next year. And no, because people in higher income brackets pay more in taxes, this is, I don't think this was not known by the Senate Republican majority when they approved this, by the way. The savings is much higher in downstate suburbs than it is upstate. So a typical Syracuse family, you will not notice how much of the savings is. If you're downstate, you get a few $100 out of this already, and it'll be $500 to $1,000 depending on your income if you're part of the 6-figure middle class in Long Island by the time it's done. This is a pretty big tax cut, and its revenue impact is going to end up being over $4 billion. It's already had an impact of about $2 billion. So, when you hear, for instance, you might hear some legislators start complaining that the property tax relief credit, if you're familiar with what that is, which was temporary, which expired at the end of last year, if they say, it's terrible, the governor let it expire, that's a $1 billion program. That's a $1 billion program in which bales of dollar bills are dropped out of helicopters and flutter into your mailbox based on a complicated formula under a temporary tax law for homeowners only. That's a lousy way to cut taxes. This is the right way to cut taxes. You can't have everything you want in this world. You want this, not that. This is a permanent law. That was a temporary program. It does not deserve to be more, and it should go away and disappear without a trace. It was a gimmick, and it was a political gimmick. And like most political gimmicks, it was expensive, but has really very little positive effect. Now, I'm going to talk in closing about, I want to talk a little bit, just quickly, I'm going to ask a couple questions, okay? I want to talk about something in the context of the figure in New York history who most deserves to be the patron saint of anything fiscally conservative that we can accomplish in New York State government. And that is this man. Alfred E. Smith was in many ways the patron saint of fiscal conservatism in New York government. Now you might say, what do you mean fiscal conservatism in New York government? The executive budget law was a product of him and his administration. It was a whole lot of government reformers, Democrats and Republicans, early in the 20th century. The man who made it happen was Al Smith. We have a strong executive budget law. I won't go into details, I have a report there. The executive budget law is designed to make it hard to increase spending. The hardest thing to do is to increase spending if the governor doesn't want to. Al Smith didn't want to increase spending faster than the resources would allow. He had been Assembly Speaker and Assembly Majority Leader in the days when the New York State budget was put together entirely by the legislature. It was complete chaos and wild spending with abandon on everything, and nobody could even track it. which it would be again if they had controlled it again. That budget law is the only thing that stands between us and the equivalent of functional equivalent of bankruptcy. Now, when you have a governor like Nelson Rockefeller or Mario Cuomo, to name the two biggest spenders of the second half of the 20th century, it doesn't work. The governor doesn't use his power to restrain the legislature. You get plenty of spending. If he's simply about cutting deals and splitting the difference between Republicans and Democrats, which Mario was, that's what you get. Rockefeller was running so fast the legislature couldn't keep up with him for a while. But that worked. This is how it works. I'm not going to go into it, but it's totally designed to make it hard to increase spending. The legislature can do whatever it wants, ultimately, if it's willing to expose itself to the governor's veto. But one thing the legislature can do that the governor can't say a word about is it can eliminate an entire item of spending or reduce it, and there's nothing he can do about it. That's all designed to hold down spending. It's a good thing. There are reforms of the budget process I would urge this party, people in this room, to think about getting behind, which Democrats in the legislature, including the Senate, Senator Kruger, the chairman of the Finance Committee, support. We should move the fiscal year start to July 1st, which is what it was until the 1940s and what it is in every state but one other state. We should have a legislative budget office model on the CBO because if it's run right, it would have caught the Medicaid overage and blown the whistle on it 2 years ahead of time. Everybody now has their head in the sand because there's nobody out there to keep an eye on this. We want the legislature to behave responsibly, quite apart from whoever's in the majority at a given time. They need to be armed to do it. We should require them to be balanced on GAAP, which is a better accounting principle. Last but not least, enforce the law. We not only have a good constitutional scheme, we have a finance law that requires quarterly financial plan updates by the governor, including one by October 31st of every year at the mid-year. Governor Cuomo has been up to 3 weeks to a month late with that report every single year since he took office. What has the legislature said about it? Nothing. We have a law, supposed quick start law, passed with much ballyhoo under Governor Spitzer his first year in office, first and only full year in office, that requires the legislature to start putting its cards on the table no later than November 5th every year. The legislature has completely ignored that requirement, blown past it, and not done it every year for several years. The legislature and the governor should obey the law and do what they're supposed to do so the process works. Conservatives tend to think, understandably, process is less important than results. But process should not be ignored. The process, there's decent rules in place, they're not being enforced. Somebody needs to start enforcing the laws and living by them. There's a whole lot of policy priorities, I won't go into them. These are things we've developed in recent years. They replicate largely in tandem with most things in the Conservative Party platform. We can talk about them if you want to. But the main, actually all of this, and it gets into the political realm of what's going on with the attempt to strip minor parties of ballot places, go down to enforce the law, run the government the way it's supposed to be run. What's happening is the wheels are coming off and the legislature is advocating this responsibility in the fiscal area just as it is in so many other areas. That's a big problem. This is something we have, and you've got a pet peeve with the New York State regulation. We're running a contest. Name the worst regulation. I'm not sure what the prize will be yet, Bob. Should we say that it's $1,000? It's $1,000. $1,000 and an all-expense-paid trip to Hawaii, if I'm telling the truth, which I'm not. Albany. An all-expense-paid trip to Albany. So I would hope you'll get on the website and do it. I probably got on too long. I'm sorry, Jerry. Should I do any questions? Okay. Questions, comments? Yes.
I hear the governor beating up on the towns and the county in
Right.
his speech. Do you know how that's going to manifest itself?
It's already it's manifesting itself in his attempt to claw back Medicaid money from the counties. The governor likes, which is surprising to one extent, because the only level of local government the governor has a benign view of is counties. The bigger the better. The more local it is, the more he talks it down and says it's bad. That's somebody from Queens. So he really has a bias against local government, pronounced. The legislature has never particularly cared to defend local government. Even legislators who are former local officials. It's never been that strong a lobby, so it's always a danger. But he's going to continue to do things to ding local governments in all sorts of ways unless they get defended more by the legislature. And I think, by the way, if there's one conservative priority that suggests, it's subsidiarity, which is the closer the level of government is to people, the more it should be protected and enhanced and protected from assaults from the government. Yes?
So we realize that there is a big concern with the $7 billion deficit. From listening to what the governor said, we share my concern that us that live in the suburbs. So the last couple of years, it's been pushing for 100% valuation of our property.
Right.
So do you think that he's going to go there to increase our taxes to cover some of the expenses that he's talking about?
I will say, and with all due respect, unfortunately, you have nothing to worry about. He is not going to go anywhere near property tax administration or assessment practices. That's unfortunate because the longer it is allowed to be uneven and sub-market rate to a different extent and a crazy quilt of practices all over the state, it delegitimizes the property tax, which in fact in many ways is the best and fairest tax. I know that's not a popular thing to say, but I think it's true. And if you look at Massachusetts, we based our property tax cap on Prop 2.5. Massachusetts requires reevaluation at market rate, no less than every 3 years, every place. That's fair. So, yes.
It's an observation and comment with this bond act. You know, we remember George Pataki's bond act from
Right.
20 years ago. But now here we are in a presidential year. He's going to put it on the ballot. More than likely it'll pass.
Right. Yes.
$3 billion to run around and spend pork.
Are you suggesting there's a political motive to putting a bond act on the ballot in an election year?
Any kind of
President?
setup.
Yeah. Bond acts, in fact, is a fiscal matter because the state, unfortunately, through a series of court rulings, has established the ability to do backdoor borrowing with impunity, statutorily, with no voter approval. And because we're a high-tax state and investors love tax-exempt New York debt and can't get enough of it, and in fact, it's actually less expensive at some times to issue personal income tax bonds just with statutory authorization than it is to issue general obligation debt, which this would be. There is no financial reason whatsoever to do a bond act. It is 100% political. It is a marketing device, a get out the vote platform. It's a wonderful fundraising opportunity for environmental groups who will appreciate it very much. It gives legislative incumbents an ability to stand up at the rally for the Environmental Bond Act and say, I voted for this wonderful thing and I urge you to too. It is 100% about political marketing. I don't know how much pushback the legislature is going to give over how to divide the money. It's a whole lot of words that eventually get up to anything you can think of that has a green tinge, with the governor making the ultimate call. The Pataki Environmental Bond Act, which was also ultimately and primarily political, and it's totally as political as this is, really. Remember the commercials for the Environmental Bond Act in '96? Remember who figured prominently in those commercials? It didn't work out too well, but a certain U.S. senator was featured in some of those commercials, in addition to the governor. That was a feel-good thing in advance of the re-election year for the governor and Senator D'Amato. It passed. It also, a more traditional legislative process, produced it. So it was very carefully designed to have something for everybody. And there was a lot of just sort of hardcore infrastructure, with a lot of hardcore water and sewer infrastructure, and more traditional environmental stuff in that. And it was very regionally balanced. This is just a big block. So it's kind of like, it's aspirational. So that makes it even worse. And it's bigger.
Stay tuned. It's coming.
Stay tuned, yes.
Last year and in past years, you talked about the 20 to 25,000 very high income earners in New York State and how dependent they are.
Right.
Where is the trend going there? Do you see people leave, or will they stay?
Well, there are no data, absolutely none, that track high income payers. You only see it afterwards leaving. Because we have confidentiality in our tax laws. And you're talking about the movements, a few hundred people within no more than 30,000 households in the state with 9 million tax filers. It's not tracked carefully. We know, for instance, Carl Icahn's going. Now, he's getting old. He probably might have, should have, was going to anyway. But that's a ding on revenues when a guy like that goes. He's taken himself and some of the people who work in his core business with him. I think, I will tell you one thing I'll point out about this budget. This is another good news piece. Anybody here recall that the governor, for 2 years before this, had his tax proposals included a symbolic proposal to quote-unquote close the carried interest loophole, which was basically meant to triple the New York State tax rate on the main source of income for people in private equity and hedge funds. Triple it. Now, it was written, it was very peculiar. It was a stunt. It was a law that would take effect if all of our neighboring states enacted the exact same law at the same time. Which was not going to happen. But it was sort of a calculated insult. I mean, you're looking at these taxpayers who generate a really high amount of taxes. And you're saying, you know, if I had my druthers, I'd triple your taxes. I think the word maybe somehow got back to the governor that it wasn't a good idea to continue to give people another reason to want to leave New York State. Because you know what? That tax proposal is not in this budget. It's just gone. It's not there anymore. Now, it was never going to happen. It was not going to happen. But it was, I think that you're kind of playing the fire when you tell people you would like to triple their taxes, and they happen to be a few hundred of the largest taxpayers in the state. So I think the governor, what he said, he meant, and he does understand it. I'm convinced. He meant every word of it, and he was correct. As time goes on, the SALT caps can have a very corrosive effect because the effective marginal rate for the highest earners, especially in New York City, is the highest it's ever been by a factor of almost 2, because deductibility had reduced our rate so much. But none of these things occur overnight. You almost wish they did, because there's a level of deniability in the legislature among advocates of higher so-called millionaire taxes, because they look around and say, what are you talking about? They're all still here. So nobody will admit there's a problem until after it occurs. One last thing. Tom Golisano, the richest man upstate New York, has produced since George Easton, a billionaire, chose to do something unusual. In 2009, he had a press conference to announce he was moving to Florida, and he said the millionaire tax was the reason it was going to cost him, I think, $15,000 a day or something. What was the reaction on the left to that? I think it was Dan Cantor, the working famous reverend. You know what the reaction was? Good riddance. So that if you want to know the test, if enough of them start leaving, that will be their reaction. They think that these people are just oblivious to this. And it's, unfortunately, it'll be too late if they're ever decisively proved wrong by data, it'll be too late to do anything about it. Yep. There's one more question? One more.
You say to enforce the law. What
Yeah.
is your enforcement if the governor refuses to put out the rules? What do you do?
That exhortation to enforce the law is aimed at the legislature in that case. The only people who can make the governor meet his reporting deadlines is the legislature. The legislature has not been holding, increasingly for a long time now, this legislature, previous legislatures have not been holding the governor's feet to the fire. Not just this governor, but it's getting much worse. He's not required to meet reporting deadlines. He's not required to issue information that he's required by statute to issue.
Well, what's the punishment?
That's what I'm saying is you're dealing with state lawmakers and lobbying. If the legislature has how can the legislature punish the governor? There's all sorts of ways. The governor has its own leverage in the budget process that it can go mano with the governor if it wants to. I think that they could embarrass him by simply making a big enough issue of it, among other things. They never say a word about it. That's the problem. So, okay? Thank you very much.